Victoria 3's Update 1.3 has been received in a rather negative fashion. The game's newest DLC, Voice of the People, has been rated poorly online, with one incredibly talented reviewer even calling it bad. The question that is now on the minds of many within the community is what this actually means for the game's future. Could it potentially even mean the ultimate demise of the game? The developer team has posted an explanation in which they detail their view of the update as well as their plans for the future, so let's take a look at that first. The dev diary begins by making it clear that they acknowledge the weaknesses especially present in the France content, citing weak points that we discussed here previously already in the review video of the DLC. The post then goes on to state that they are working to make the released content better, and that the first update to this will be released on the 26th of June, with an additional content update coming in Q3. Now, before we get into the details of whether exactly the changes are good and satisfactory, let me be clear about something that many people who either haven't worked in an office setting or more specifically haven't worked in a project-based company may not be properly aware of. The release was bad, no doubt, but bad releases happen. They're never pleasant, but on a statistical level they will happen given enough time. Microsoft has created plenty of awful Windows releases, YouTube has made plenty of awful changes to its platform, and your favorite game studio, whatever that may be, has released or will be releasing something that isn't good given enough time. What doesn't always happen is that a development team actually gets the budget and resources to revisit their bad release in depth as soon as possible to fix whatever content issues are contained within it. If you follow the channel, you will know how much I wish CK3 would revisit the whole in-code mechanic, and yet how far away that seems to be. The immediate backlash post-DLC has been intense, and the developer team acknowledging that this is an issue to be addressed quickly is the only correct path that was available from our outside perspective. However, I was far from certain that this path would be the one taken. My biggest fear was that we would be looking at the French content in its current form until 3, 4 or maybe 5 years would have passed. Similar to how, for example, the much-lauded Custodian initiative for Stellaris started cleaning up old content only long after its release. Getting the time and budget to rework already released content is not always a given. This is one of the many instances where giving the right feedback leads to the right results. Now let's take a look at what they're actually doing. As far as the actual content is concerned, the Divided Monarchist journal entry is being altered with high priority and in an excellent fashion. All 3 dynasties will have progress bars that progress based on what actually happens within your nation, rather than based on you clicking a button. The changes that the developers are describing here should introduce a much livelier political struggle in France. It will come with unique conditions, and once you establish a dynasty on the throne, you must indeed do more than simply wait. You have to prove that they are the best choice for France by showing that they are capable of ruling. What that will look like is not quite clear yet, so judging it is difficult. However, this does sound much more like what I wanted this journal entry to look like in the first place. What's more, the French AI also is to be revisited so that it can be properly executing its journal entries, and even exhibit different behavior in general based on what dynasty wins out in the struggle for glory. Should no dynasty succeed in properly establishing itself, France may yet return to dynastic squabbling once more, potentially even leading into republicanism for once and for all. The journal entry related to the Rhine crisis, that is, the natural borders of France, is also being revisited to turn it into something that actually resembles the Rhine crisis, allowing the involved and threatened parties to react appropriately. Haiti will be getting its own journal entry as well, and various pieces of content will receive a revamp in terms of giving out notifications. The world of Victoria 3 does have a lot going on, but the player is rarely informed of anything interesting happening. This has been an issue both for the content in the DLC, but also for example, Springtime of the Peoples. The update scheduled for the 26th of June will also revisit my personal nemesis, the industry band law, hopefully altering it in a fashion that slots it into the rest of the game much more nicely. So, while we are still fairly vague on a couple of things that they're changing here, if this had been what the content had looked like at the release of the DLC, my personal review, and I dare say the opinion on the DLC in general, would have looked significantly different from what it turned out to be. I am a firm believer in criticizing things when there are things to be criticized. In the same vein, I am a firm believer in praising things when there are things to be praised. As far as the DLC and 1.3 is concerned, the milk has been spilled. Nobody should get that twisted. However, the quick reaction by the dev team, the full acknowledgement of the criticisms, and the clear willingness to mop up the spilled milk is, as previously mentioned, the best case scenario available here. So, all in all, I'm very positive regarding the reaction that we are seeing here from the Victoria 3 dev team after the DLC's release. But let's cut to the chase of the overarching topic. Where does all of this leave Victoria 3? It is rather self-evident that Victoria 3 is more of a niche game than many of its Grand Strategy siblings, and the game had a rocky start and a rocky first immersion pack. Could this potentially mean that the game is looking into the abyss of Imperator Rome? that is to say, into the abyss of being abandoned? For this entire topic, I would like to ask all of us to take a step back. Many people, be it on the official forums or elsewhere, have debated whether Victoria 3 is walking towards its own downfall, and any given debate has been primarily focused on the question of daily Steam players. Are they too low? Are they high enough? Is this the end? Today, quite frankly, I want to do my best to pull this discussion back into reality, because a good chunk of the arguments thrown around here are utterly delusional, as they're helplessly unaware of what is actually going on. And a low information community is never a good community if you are a part of it. So, let's talk about the value of discussing Steam player numbers. When we compare Steam player numbers between different games, we appear to be getting a raw impression of what is going on. Victoria 3 is quite significantly less popular than, for example, Hearts of Iron 4, Stellaris or CK3. All of these are also indeed quite significantly more popular than Imperator Rome, even at the best of days. And yet, none of these numbers are really even in the same room when it comes to evaluating them. Again, to be more direct than you might be used from me, for a community that prides itself on reading and acting on statistics in-game, a huge chunk of this debate is effectively statistics illiterate. Let's talk Turkey. Imperator Rome was released at a base price of $39.99, similar to Stellaris or, for example, Hoi 4, with a deluxe edition that had fairly little to offer at $54.99. It was not an expansion pass, but simply gave you some wallpapers, a forum icon, forum avatar, a small flavor pack, and some art stuff. On a very, very basic level. This means that Imperator Rome had few initial buyers, and those buyers spent fairly little money on the game without any form of long-term commitment. This is how every single game was sold until Crusader Kings 3. Your upgraded versions gave you some type of bonus stuff, maybe some ships or an extra race, and that's about it. Victoria 3 was released at a base price of $49.99 with a deluxe version that has quite a lot more to offer, while also asking for quite a lot more money at $79.99. It does not act as a form of goodie bag, but rather as an expansion pass in which the customer pays $30 extra and receives content that would normally cost them $54.96 at retail pricing. An incredibly important difference should already be self-evident here. When we want to evaluate just how viable Victoria 3 is as a product, looking at the Steam numbers is a waste of time. A single player for Imperator Rome, Hoi 4 or Stellaris means a whole lot less compared to a single player of Victoria 3, both on a financial level, but also on how tight they are to the future content of the game in average. What might surprise you as well is that further development of Victoria 3 is already at least partially financed by virtue of many buyers immediately opting into purchasing an expansion pass. While I'm not sure what the numbers are here for Victoria 3, I remember statements about 60% of CK3 players having purchased the Royal Edition rather than just the base game edition. I hope that this makes the scale of the difference here quite clear. Many Paradox players know that they will be buying the DLCs anyway, so they take the expansion pass that cuts down on additional costs they would otherwise incur anyway. Paradox knows this. This is why this new model exists. Paradox knows it works. A change in model, though, that seems to have bypassed the dedicated fanbase entirely, as said fanbase debates the games as though they were on equal footing. I think it's fair to say that almost everybody has realized that prices increased in 2022 in general, but people seem to be unaware of the fact that starting with CK3, games have been employing an entirely different long-term support structure. A structure that binds customers much more tightly to these games than before, for better and for worse. Now let me clarify something here though. Does this mean that Victoria 3 will run as a game forever and ever and ever? Obviously it doesn't. While the general conditions are much more permissive, development costs have also changed over the years, as well as profit expectations. What the exact value equation for Victoria 3 is unknowable from the outside. We do know from Paradox's recent investor-oriented presentation that Victoria 3 is already profitable. What we can say is also that Steam player number comparison debates are, as we say in German, Milchmädchenrechnungen at best. It's simply a waste of time. Please stop having these conversations and move on to something more important. Now, before we do that in this video, there is something about this discussion on a meta level that we really can't skip over, as being aware of it gives more power to the community. Just why is the community discussing the question of abandonment as intensely as they are, and what does that mean? In the last 2 decades, Paradox has fought tooth and nail for a privileged business position that many grand strategy indie developers wish they had. Hell, I wish that the grand strategy indie developers had this, because it would make life much easier for them. It is a model where both the fanbase and the trust the fanbase has is big enough to support something as niche as grand strategy games for as long as possible. See, that's not actually normal. Normally, grand strategy games are made and the developers then move on to make the same game but slightly better, as maintaining the original game is not really financially viable for them at all. So it's either move on and make a new game, or make a DLC and go bankrupt. Paradox doesn't really need to worry about this. And that's exactly the crux of the issue. Imperator Rome had an infinitely worse standing on a financial level, as far fewer players bought it and their buy-in was significantly lower. And yet it received post-release support for almost 2 years. A short time for a Paradox game, but a long time for a game that was dead on arrival. So why is that? The answer here lies in the realm of brand management. When Imperator Rome was abandoned, it had received a significant and, from a customer perspective, rather cheap overhaul. 1.0 was virtually a different game from 2.0. It is fair to say that from Paradox's perspective, Imperator Rome had no chance of recovering long before it got abandoned. Simply put, Paradox didn't have much choice in still having to support it to at least 2.0. The privileged position the company holds also comes with responsibilities if one wants to maintain it. If the customer's trust erodes enough, the long-term model in which Paradox wants customers to commit to long-term support, and the customers want Paradox to honor that long-term support even past the first few years, would be in shambles. Imperator Rome had little to no chance of recovery at any point after release, and it also was not profitable, and nonetheless received 2 years of support. While the community as a whole justifiably sees the abandonment of Imperator as an erosion of trust, had Paradox buried it faster than they actually did, the erosion would have been infinitely more intense. To make it quite clear, any game that comes out of the grand strategy-focused Paradox development studios cannot be easily abandoned by them, because the damage this would do to the core business model of the company is infinitely worse for them than losing money on an unprofitable project. People are already endlessly discussing whether Paradox is no longer honoring the aforementioned responsibility, and that is after a failed game had been left alone after 2 years of post-release support. It's important to be aware of what drives corporate decision-making, or you're arguing about things on a level that is totally disconnected from reality. Arguing over Steam player numbers is a sign that the community totally missed what changed over the last few years, and why Imperator Rome went the way it did. Instead of having those debates, I would love to talk about something else. So, if we can't really determine where Victoria 3 is going, but if Victoria 3 can't simply be thrown out the window either, even if it were unprofitable, which it isn't because the brand damage would be far worse, what should we be talking about then? In this situation, the fruitful debates aren't really about whether Victoria 3 is going to be there in the foreseeable future, but rather what it should look like. We can see that the team is responsive with today's dev diary, which ultimately means communicating our most pressing issues in the clearest way possible is the best thing we can do to get the game to be what we want it to be. The devs have now given us a first glimpse at what is to come in the next 9 months or so. June will see one major patch as discussed above, and Q3 and Q4 will feature an open beta, as well as of course the art pack DLC that is included in the Grand Edition. This DLC will bring a customizable day-night cycle with it. Then, in Q1 2024, there will be the first major expansion, which is also included in the Grand Edition and focuses on diplomacy. While we don't know many details, the DLC and the accompanying patch appear to be addressing the topics of diplomacy, foreign investment, and forming more dynamic diplomatic power blocks. That all sounds neat, but considering the lack of detail, I would like to divert your attention to a much more important topic: the upcoming patches this year. When it comes to those, here is my list of what I think these patches have to deal with. First of all, a higher quality standard needs to be established for any given patch and DLC. We can say whatever we want about Voice of the People's content, but an unpleasant amount of bugs have been prevalent in every single patch that we've had available to us of Victoria 3, with 1.2 being the comparatively smoothest experience because of the open beta that came before it. This has to end. A new standard has to become a new normal no matter what, and it has to start with the upcoming patches. Number 2 for me is making annoying systems much less annoying. Let me explain what I mean here. The best example will probably be the warfare system. It's about making the warfare system not be annoying. Listen, there are many features we can put in, but whenever my front splits and my entire progress gets rolled back because I didn't have multiple generals on this front line, what do you want me to say? It just sucks. Other systems also do suffer from this, like for example AI mood swings in diplomacy, trade or market access cutoffs. These are all hygiene factors that should be cleaned up before we even really dive into concepts such as making them better and expanding on them. And then number 3 for me is a very important underlying dynamic, locking in a certain level of balancing expectations. Victoria 3's patches don't only suffer from bugs, but also from balancing that is all over the place. While the immense power of agitators in the initial 1.3 patch is a good example here, this is also true when it comes to things such as population growth, economic growth, how often certain events transpire, like the German unification or the Italian unification, how stable or revolution-locked countries are, where the world's political tendencies lie, and so on. For example, in the current patch, a myriad of council republics will pop up because the general political play is simply not well balanced enough. In the past, on the other hand, the AI would trend towards virtually always just remaining with the same laws as in the start. Mind you, I'm not saying that we should limit the world too much. Rather, I am saying, for example, pop growth should generally lie within a tighter expected frame. This frame, once determined, should be the target for every patch going forward, so that a certain level of expected normalcy keeps itself steady between patches. When your game reaches 1936 in patch 1.3, 1.4, 1.5 and so on, you should generally be looking at a fairly standard growth in population, economy and so on. If that doesn't happen, nothing will ever truly be balanced, because everything works around these systems. These 3 points are personally my top priorities that are bouncing around my head the entire time and that I need the dev team to solve, because it is just that important. If your top priorities differ, then let me know in the comments, because I want to know what yours are so that I can include it in any consideration that I make, much like the devs include anything in theirs. Please do me a favor and stop debating Steam numbers that are completely unrelated to one another and start debating the actual game. For the moment though, I'm on Proper Varian and I will see you later, Alligator.